Okay, so today we're diving deep into some really heavy stuff, the 2009 BDR tragedy, and we're going to be looking at some audio excerpts from a recent online discussion.
Yeah, this audio, it features a woman who identifies as a victim of the tragedy. She refers to herself as Mahaapu or sometimes Pito, and she really goes into detail about her experiences and what she's observed over the years.
Right, and it's not just her talking. We'll also be hearing from other people who are part of that online forum.
Yeah, they chime in with their own thoughts and questions. It's really interesting to hear these different perspectives all coming together.
So yeah, for this deep dive, we're going to try to break down some of the complex issues and personal stories that come up in this discussion, all centered around the BDR tragedy.
Exactly, because it's not just about what happened, it's about the aftermath and this ongoing search for justice and accountability.
And I think that's what makes this audio so compelling. It's
Yeah.
not just a historical recounting. It's about the very real and very raw experiences of those who were directly impacted.
Exactly. And just to give you a sense of where we're starting, the audio begins with a few technical issues, typical online forum stuff, and then the host tries to get Maha Apu connected.
Right. And the very first question they ask her is actually a multi-parter. It's about allegations that someone named Elias Hossein has apparently made against a family member of one of the victims.
Yeah, and they also ask her about her opinions on this guy, Ayatollah Beheshti, who seems to be involved in coordinating their legal case. And then there's this question about whether LM Fazlur Rahman can really handle the whole case by himself.
Right. So a lot to unpack just in that first question. And we get a sense of where Maha Apu stands when she starts talking about LM Fazlur Rahman's team.
Yeah, and her initial response is actually pretty optimistic about it. She seems to think that most people on the team are good and that despite what others might say, she still believes in a positive outcome.
Yeah, she starts off by saying that, there are these criticisms and allegations, but she's choosing to focus on the hope that things will work out.
Exactly, but then there's this noticeable shift in her tone. She starts talking about this growing feeling of obstruction and being silenced.
Right. And what's really interesting is that she says this isn't just something she felt back in 2009 when it all happened. It's been happening even recently within the past 9 months or so.
Yeah, she feels like there's this pressure coming from different individuals, even some who are present in this online discussion, to kind of keep her quiet.
Yeah. And this leads her to talk about her views on Elias Hossein and Ayatollah Beheshti. And let's start with Hossein. She seems to have some pretty strong opinions about his work.
Yeah, she says flat out that she hasn't seen any interviews with the victims' families in anything he's done. And, considering the scale of the killings and the number of families affected, she sees this as a huge problem.
Right. It's like he's telling a story without actually talking to the people who lived through it.
Yeah, and it gets even more personal when she talks about her experience with his documentary. She points out these inconsistencies about her communication with her husband, Tanvir, after the events began.
Like, what specifically is she referring to?
So she very clearly states that her phone, along with everything else in their house, was taken away by the authorities.
Right. I mean, that makes sense in a situation like that.
Yeah, but then she says that in Hossein's documentary, there's this suggestion that they spoke on the 27th, based on a statement from some Sepoy Mohit about two phone calls. One was supposedly in formal language and the other informal.
So wait, he's claiming she talked to her husband when her phone was confiscated.
That's what she's saying, and it clearly doesn't add up for her. She's like, how could my husband possibly have called me when my phone was gone and I was, you know, running around in a state of panic between hospitals and trying to figure out what was going on?
Yeah, I can see why that would be so disturbing for her.
Exactly. And she goes on to say that, her in-laws and her husband's friends from cadet college, they were given a landline for a little while to try and get in touch, but all they heard were instructions coming from the RAB.
The Rapid Action Battalion.
Right. And she's adamant that there wasn't any actual conversation. It was just one-way communication from the RAB. So yeah, this discrepancy in Hossein's account is a big deal for her.
It's a very direct contradiction, and she's not letting it slide.
Not at all. And then she takes it a step further. She describes her own experience with Dedi Touhid and the brutal treatment she received from him.
And this is important because it directly challenges those who say that her husband wasn't killed by gunfire, but by sharp weapons or something.
Right. She's basically saying, if I was subjected to this level of violence by Touhid, then the idea that others weren't killed by gunfire just doesn't make sense.
So what exactly happened to her?
She describes being beaten so badly that her clothes were torn, and she says another woman had to give her something else to wear. She really paints a picture of the brutality of what was happening.
It's a pretty powerful image, and it really underscores the violence of those events.
Yeah, and then she talks about this encounter she had with Ayatollah Beheshti, who we mentioned earlier, was involved in coordinating their legal case.
Right, so what happened there?
So she says she personally told him about Dad Tuhid's actions and how he was manipulating the situation with his children.
Oh, wow. So how is he doing that?
So apparently, this BDR member named Faisal Alam, who she says was connected to the Jubo League, brought a whole group of people to meet her, and Tuhid's children were among them.
The Jubilee, that's the youth wing of a political party, right?
Yeah, and she felt like these kids were being coached to lie about their father's identity.
That's really messed up using children like that.
Exactly. And she goes on to say that she was really disappointed with how Beheshti acted after she told him all of this.
So it sounds like he didn't really take her seriously or didn't do anything with the information.
That seems to be her takeaway. And what's interesting is that she draws this parallel to her experience with Mahin Sarkar, another guy who she says distanced himself from her after she shared similar revelations.
So it's like there's this pattern of people who are supposed to be representing the BDR soldiers, but they don't want to acknowledge the bad stuff that some individuals might have done.
Yeah, it's like they're protecting their own.
Which makes you wonder about the narrative that's being pushed, right?
Exactly. And then she raises this really big accusation. She points out that the people who were arguing that all the BDR soldiers were victims seem to be really focused on the families of certain individuals like Dad Abdurrahim, whose son is now an advocate, and Dad Tuhid.
So she's questioning why these families are getting so much attention, given what their husbands or fathers allegedly did to the officers.
Right. It's like she's saying, why are we focusing on them when there's evidence suggesting they might have been involved in the violence?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it makes you think about who's controlling the narrative.
Yeah, for sure. And then she goes on to talk about the online harassment she's faced. People claiming to be BDR members, attacking her on social media, accusing her of wanting money, and even saying that her husband is still alive.
Wow, that's just awful. I mean, that's straight up character assassination.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to silence her and discredit her.
And she brings up this fundamental question, right? If the NSG and a few others were the only ones involved in the violence and killings, then who did all the rest of it, like the searching and the killing that happened later on?
Right. She specifically mentions Dedi Tuhid and Dade Rahim being in the quarter guard during these events, which implies that they were involved in the wider violence.
Yeah, it definitely raises more questions than it answers,
Right.
and it sets up this next topic about the potential for a cover-up.
Right. The idea being that maybe the army chief at the time, families that were compromised, and other people were all working together to make it seem like India wasn't involved.
And that's a huge allegation, right?
Yeah, incredibly serious stuff. And Maha Apu's response is really revealing. She talks about how difficult it was to even get an appointment with the army chief at one point.
So what happened?
She says she was told by the army headquarters to just stay quiet and they would support her, but she felt like that just made her even angrier.
Yeah, I mean, if you're being told to shut up when you're looking for answers, it's understandable that you'd be upset.
Exactly. And then she talks about this time when Colonel Hack became the chairman of RAOA, that's the Retired Armed Forces Officers Welfare Association. And from that point on, she felt like there was absolutely no way to reach the chief directly.
Like he was completely inaccessible.
Yeah, she describes all these layers of officers and even some of the wives of officers acting as barriers. She'd try to explain that she needed to see the chief regarding her husband's investigation, and she'd just be told that he wasn't available.
So she felt totally shut off.
Yeah, completely blocked. And what she says next is really important. She's like, I don't know if the chief genuinely didn't know I was trying to reach him or if he chose not to meet with me.
Either way, it's a pretty bad look, right?
Yeah, I mean, she's saying that as the head of the BDR at the time, he had a responsibility to be aware of what was going on with all the families who were affected, all 57 of them.
Yeah, she's not letting him off the hook. And then she names some specific people who she believes are actually withholding information from the chief.
Right. She mentions the wives of Colonel Mujib, Lieutenant Colonel Inshad, and Lieutenant Colonel Kudrat Elahahi.
So it's not just external forces, there's also this internal dynamic at play.
Exactly. And she also mentions Hassan Nasir and Hassan Bai, saying that they were told to exclude her from certain things.
So she's being actively shut out.
Yeah, and that meant that her voice and her information wasn't reaching the legal advisors who were working on the case.
Which is incredibly frustrating for her, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then she brings up this thing she calls Project A, and she names a few people she thinks are involved. Advocate Saki Brahman, the Deej's son, Rakin Mujib's daughter, Tara Mujib, and Dr. Fabliha Bushra.
So what is this Project A all about?
Well, her accusation is that they're basically planning to spread propaganda against her specifically.
Wow, so why would they do that?
She thinks they're trying to discredit her efforts to gather information, especially anything that might point to the involvement of BDR soldiers beyond a certain narrative.
Like they're trying to control the story.
Yeah, and she even claims to have documentation of this, like communications and stuff.
Which is pretty bold. I mean, if she has proof, that's huge.
It would be, but we don't actually see that proof in this audio.
Right, so it's her word against theirs, but it's still a very serious allegation.
Definitely. And then she goes on to say that she thinks some Army families might have been compromised or pressured to avoid mentioning India.
And that's suggesting some kind of external influence, right?
Yeah, like a deliberate attempt to silence certain perspectives.
And then she brings up General Tariq Siddiqui.
Yeah, she claims he received undue benefits, and that might be why he allegedly played a role in preventing information from reaching the Army chief.
So again, this idea of a cover-up.
Exactly. And when they ask her about the current Army leadership under General Wakaruzaman, she's pretty cautious.
Like, she doesn't want to jump to conclusions.
Yeah, she says straight up that she won't comment until she's had a chance to talk to him directly and see how he acts regarding the BDR issue.
So she's reserving judgment for now.
Exactly. And her experiences with Colonel Hack, the RAOA chairman we talked about before, seem to have been negative, too.
So what happened there?
She says that after he became chairman, his behavior towards her changed, and she thinks he might have been trying to stop information from reaching the Army chief.
So another potential roadblock.
Yeah, and she also talks about her attempts to show what she considers to be important evidence to the chief advisor, and she says that some of the victims' families were trying to keep her out of these processes.
Like they didn't want her involved at all.
Yeah, she even claims they were trying to stop her from meeting with the chief advisor, and maybe even the chief himself.
It's like she's facing resistance at every turn.
Yeah, and this leads to a really interesting point about how different families are treated. She uses the example of the Beg's child being called the biggest victim, while other children who lost both parents are kind of overlooked.
So there's this hierarchy of victimhood almost.
Yeah, which is really sad, and she tells the story about Colonel Mujib's wife basically dismissing the lack of support for families of more junior officers.
It's like there's this division even within the community of victims' families.
Yeah, and she's also very skeptical of Major General Jahangir Kabir Talukdar and his potential role in any future investigation.
Why is that?
She says she and others have had bad experiences with him, including allegations of harassment and accusatory questioning.
So she doesn't trust him to be impartial.
Not at all. And then we get this new information from someone named Asifur Rahman, who's participating in the online forum.
What does he say?
So he's talking about this interview he heard recently where it was claimed that Maha Apu's husband, Tanvir, was picked up by a vehicle with an army guard and an Awami League leader pretending to be rescuing him.
Oh, wow. So they took him under false pretenses.
Yeah, and the implication is that they then took him to a torture cell and probably killed him.
That's a really disturbing detail.
Yeah, and Maha Apu hadn't heard this before, so she's obviously really interested in finding out more.
It's like a new piece of the puzzle suddenly emerges.
Exactly. And another participant, Tuhin, mentions that this information might have been talked about on Amar Desh, which is a media outlet.
So it's not coming out of nowhere. It's something that's been circulating.
Yeah, and then they briefly touch on the arrest of Mahbub Arajini in connection with the BDR events.
Right. And also Farooq Khan, another Awami League leader who's apparently also under arrest.
Yeah, so it shows that this is still an active investigation, even though it's been years.
And then someone in the online forum makes some very strong accusations against Colonel Mujib.
Yeah, they're alleging corruption and theft, and they say that other officers like Major Aziz knew about it.
So it's not just speculation. They're saying there's actual knowledge of this.
Right, and then Maha Pau starts talking about specific instances where she feels like her husband Tanvir was targeted even before the BDR tragedy.
Like he was already on someone's radar.
Exactly, and she gives some pretty detailed examples. The first one is this incident during the BDR week parade in 2009, right before the tragedy.
What happened there?
So she says, Sheikh Hasina was personally questioning each officer, including Tanvir, about their family connections to the Awami League, and then she makes this really weird comment to Tanvir about him supposedly preferring Ziaur Rahman based on a childhood photo where he's wearing sunglasses.
What? That's so random. Why would she even say that?
Yeah, it seemed totally out of context and really bizarre to him. And she clarifies that the photo was taken back in 1992 when he was at cadet college.
Oh, so it was from years ago.
Yeah, and he was wearing sunglasses that a senior had given him, and some of his friends joked that he looked like Ziaur Rahman, but that was just a casual remark. And then years later, the prime minister brings it up during an official parade.
It's kind of chilling, actually. Like, it suggests this deep level of scrutiny or maybe even suspicion.
Yeah, and then she mentions these other things that were strange, like people suggesting that he was being targeted because he was a really good shooter.
Oh, like he was a threat because of his
Yeah.
skills?
Yeah, she says he was trained as a sniper and his abilities were officially noted. And there was this other weird situation during election duty in 2008 where he and other junior officers were locked in a room.
Seriously locked in a room.
Yeah, and this led to some conflict with Colonel Aftab, who's now deceased, and sadly, Tanvir is also deceased now.
It's just tragic all around.
Yeah, and then she talks about being targeted by Amir Hossein Amu from the Awami League because she believes her husband was trying to stop smuggling operations.
Wow, so he was taking on some powerful people.
Yeah, and she even describes this near-fatal attack on herself and her child, which she thinks was a direct result of her husband's actions against these smugglers.
So they were trying to intimidate him or silence him?
It seems that way, and then she reminds us that before the BDR tragedy, Tanvir was involved in Operation Clean Heart as a lieutenant, and he arrested General Aziz's brother Joseph and also Haji Makbul, both of whom apparently threatened him.
So he wasn't afraid to go after people who were connected.
No, not at all. And then she drops this really strange detail. She claims she saw people who looked Korean or Chinese at the quarter guard on February 25th, the day the attack started.
What? Seriously?
Yeah, she says she saw them herself, and if that's true, it would suggest some kind of external involvement.
That's a huge claim, and it's
Yeah.
something that really needs to be investigated further.
Absolutely. And throughout this whole account, Maha Apu keeps emphasizing how difficult it's been for her to get justice and how she's faced so much opposition from within the victims' families.
Like they're working against her.
Yeah, she specifically mentions Colonel Mujib's wife and others like Shaheen Siddiqui and Tarek Siddiqui as being influential in isolating her and calling her a bad character.
So it's like a smear campaign to discredit her.
Yeah, and she also expresses this distrust of the Shahid Sena Association, saying that she thinks some of the other widows don't realize they're associating with the wife of someone who might have been involved in their husband's deaths.
It's such a complex and messy situation.
Yeah, and then she mentions this recent claim that people are trying to fabricate phone conversations between her and her husband to make her look bad.
Oh, wow. So they're trying to create fake evidence.
It seems that way, and she also talks about how hard it's been to get other widows to sign on to filing a case at the International Crimes Tribunal.
So she's facing all these obstacles,
Yeah, she says some initially agreed and then backed out because they were pressured.
which is understandable in a situation where people are afraid of the consequences.
Yeah, and then she makes this really shocking allegation about the wife of a trust bank, DMD Mrs. Hasna Henna, whose husband, Major Shahid Shanawaz, was also a victim.
What did she do?
So Maha Apu claims that Mrs. Hasna Henna used her influence to get out of some corruption allegations against her by implicating Army officers in the BDR killings.
Wow. So she basically threw the army under the bus to save herself.
That's the accusation, and if it's true, it's really messed up.
Yeah, using a tragedy like that for personal gain is just beyond the pale.
And then towards the end of the discussion, you can hear other people expressing their support for Maha Apu.
Yeah, they commend her strength and encourage her to keep fighting for justice.
It's a moment of solidarity after all the heavy stuff she shared.
And it really brings home the human cost of this tragedy.
Yeah, it's not just about facts and figures. It's about real people whose lives have been irrevocably changed.
Absolutely. And I think as listeners, it's important to remember that this is just one person's perspective. There might be other interpretations of these events, but it's still incredibly valuable to hear her story.
Yeah, and to acknowledge the pain and the trauma that she and other victims' families have experienced.
And it leaves us with so many questions. What does true accountability even look like in a situation like this? And how can we ensure that justice is served when so much time has passed?
It makes you think about the role of society in all of this.
Right.
What is our responsibility to ensure that something like this never happens again?
It's a lot to grapple with, and it's
Oh.
definitely something that stays with you long after you've heard the audio.
For sure. And, if you're interested in learning more about this, I think exploring news archives and maybe watching some documentaries about the BDR tragedy could be really informative.
Yeah, it's an event that deserves our attention and our reflection.
Absolutely, because the pursuit of truth and justice is an ongoing process.
And it's one that we should all be a part of.